psychology at Massey, and then a master's in health science degree through the University of Otago, which explored the rehabilitation experiences of those living with tetraplegia. With his keen interest in rehabilitation and disability issues, Johnny is currently teaching a paper regarding independent living at CIPT, and I know he does some disability work with disability studies lecturing at Massey as well. So we are delighted to have him here to talk to us about his experience in his PhD.
Thanks, Tracy.
Yeah.
It should be just on the side of the desktop if you have. I'll see the other one on the desktop there.
Yeah.
The blue things. Oh, yeah.
They're on there.
I'll see if that stretches out. Can you put it on the left there?
No, it's not happening.
That's alright.
It's a very short chain. It only goes to the back. Oh, we done.
No, I can do it. I'll come actually, if you put it on the edge of that table, I'll come closer to the table over there. I usually like to start off talks with a random piece of information. And the random one today is last night while we were trying to put a trampoline together for our 4-year-old boys, I managed to bend my big toe back quite badly. So I don't know if my feelings of uncomfortableness right now are from my toe or the fact that I'm about to present in a public space. So I think it's the public space, so we'll soon see. There's a doctor in the room around the back. Yeah, as many of you know in the room, I'm coming towards the end of my PhD. So today I'm going to talk about the second phase of that PhD. But in the spirit of the Bale peer group, I'm going to try to keep it interesting and relaxed and not overwhelm you with all the data from the survey. I'll save that for the conferences, but hopefully give you enough as well to show you what I've been doing. And then also hopefully leave you with some questions and some areas of interest. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about sampling. As Philip knows, we investigated a unique sampling approach, and then also finish the presentation with some ideas about universal design and what that means. To start off with some acknowledgements, the University of Canterbury, a doctoral scholarship from the University of Canterbury, which was incredibly helpful. Also the Bourke Academy of Independent Living was a Bale scholar throughout most of my PhD tenureship with them. And so as Tracy was saying earlier, incredibly helpful just for that support really, coffee groups and just that kind of informal support. Anyone who's done any form of study, especially postgraduate study, will know how intense it is and how great it is to talk it through with people. I've got a really, really fantastic supervisor team. Philip Schluter from the University of Canterbury, your knowledge has been incredibly valuable. Also Jean-Hay Smith and Debbie Snell, Debbie's from Bale and the University of Otago. Jean-Hay Smith, who was just mentioned, is from the University of Otago also. A good friend of mine, Anne Sinnott, has been a mentor throughout the project, which has been incredibly helpful also. But most importantly, the participants for their valuable time. Without the participants, there is no research. And the funding also came from the ones on the right there too, which was deserves due acknowledgement. Rotary, the Ministry of Social Development, and the Rata Foundation. So in one slide, this is more or less what my PhD looks like. 3 big blobs. The first one was a qualitative phase. That led to instrument development, and what I'll talk about mostly today is the second quantitative phase. It's called an exploratory mixed method design. The reason it was chosen for this research question, which is, I should have started with, looking at community inclusion for people who use wheelchairs as community recovers, as Christchurch recovers, from the 2010 and 11 earthquakes. Exploratory mixed methods design are most appropriate for a topic that doesn't have a lot of research done in that area. So it's quite intuitive that you would want to explore that area because you don't have any literature to really base your questions or hypotheses on. So the qualitative phase was done first, individual and group interviews with 13 people who use wheelchairs. Each interview was roughly about an hour long, and actually Tracy's slide was quite handy. I did Braun and Clark's thematic analysis, yeah, which is really good. And that provided us with some themes that I'll allude to in a second, and helped us develop a survey instrument which was administered for the second phase. So the 5 key themes for phase 1 are the earthquake magnifies barriers. So there were a lot of pre-existing barriers to community inclusion prior to the earthquakes even occurring. Once the earthquakes occurred, a lot of these barriers, housing, access to public spaces, etc., were magnified. The second one was that community inclusion takes energy when you use a wheelchair. You have to maintain all this extra stuff to use a wheelchair, and when you face barriers, I suppose it just taxes your finite amount of energy that you have at the start of the day. The social connections are important. If you can access the community, you can engage in social connections and your social life. But if there's barriers, it inhibits you from even engaging. Another part of that was that if you have good social connections around you, it actually facilitates community inclusion and participation. The themes 4 and 5, they relate to the post-earthquake environment and opportunity found. And increasing community inclusion in cities and increasing accessibility, it's quite a complex thing, obviously. It's hard to do because you have this infrastructure, you have a culture in place, so to completely change it to make it more accessible is quite difficult, apart from potentially when you have an earthquake and you rebuild a city, which you very rarely do. But by the same token, is it also an opportunity lost if we don't take advantage of that opportunity? But to move on to the survey, so based on those themes, we developed a 41-question survey. These were the 5 main areas of the survey: background information, demographics, mobility information, and then from 3 to 5 there is based on the themes from phase 1. So we asked participants about community accessibility and their social networks, and also their perceptions of the future. The design was a cross-sectional survey. The inclusion criteria were that you use a wheelchair as your main form of mobility, and that was self-reported. A resident in New Zealand, aged over 16 years, be able to read English, and have access to the internet and an operational email account. That referred to the fact that it was administered by SurveyMonkey in the first instance. I'll allude to it in a second, but we did send out hard copies once we'd negotiated our first sampling approach, which I'll talk about now. It was administered between November 2015 and March 2016. Actually, that's a typo. It was actually administered from October 2015. That's why I'm presenting this now and not at a conference. So, sampling, and this actually builds on Tracy's presentation about registries. If you wanted to sample in a quantitative fashion wheelchair users in New Zealand, there's no sampling frame. There's no registry, there's no Richard Smale's research explored a lot of this area as well. We don't know how many people use wheelchairs in New Zealand, let alone Christchurch. So how do you best, what's your mode of contact to that population? Recruitment in this area is often limited to disability organisations, personal contacts, and advertising in public. That's more or less kind of the best way you can do it. So consequently, wheelchair users constitute a hidden population of sorts. Under-researched if we don't know how many people are out there or anything about them, and they're effectively excluded from any population estimates. So it's quite a dilemma, really. So, what to do? One potential option is something called respondent-driven sampling, or RDS as I'll refer to it. It's effectively a chain referral approach, and if a number of assumptions are met, it can provide unbiased population-based estimates. Those assumptions include tracing the recruitment chains, which is a bit different to classic convenience or snowball sampling. So in respondent-driven sampling, the first wave of participants is given a letter, and each time they allocate 3 codes out to the next wave, and then when you ask them to fill out the survey, they put their code in, and then you have a way of tracking who recruited who. Another assumption or requirement actually is that participants provide an estimate of their network size, which is roughly speaking the amount of people they know in the population. And the third requirement is that participants randomly select from their networks. That third assumption has been open to some debate, and there's some papers published querying whether that can actually be done in practice, but I won't delve into that at the moment. So if all that stuff can be done and that can be met and achieved, then there's some statistical analysis you can perform to compute how many waves is needed to reach equilibrium distribution. I'm hoping you guys have all had a coffee actually before we sat down here today. There'll be a test afterwards as well. Equilibrium distribution basically means the sample becomes independent of original participants. So that's always been the challenge with any snowball or convenient sample. You don't actually lose the bias of that original wave. This approach, if done properly and achieved, can potentially. So what's the point of that in the first place? It's so you can infer that your findings are representative of the population. So how did we go? We sent invitations out, seeking seats to, as I mentioned, the classic modes of contact, disability organisations, posters in libraries, supermarkets and hospitals. 20 people made contact, 12 people, seeds they're called, the first wave of participants, completed the survey. They were asked to recruit 3 other people each. 7 people in the first wave completed the survey. So we got a total of 19 people, and unfortunately it wasn't enough to qualify for that term I just mentioned, equilibrium distribution. The key reason that it didn't qualify was that only one wave of recruitment can't achieve what's called in-equilibrium data. You need in-equilibrium data to ensure that any inferences you make are independent of the initial seeds. So it was still an experience, it was still a story to tell, it was still completely worth doing because we didn't know how it was going to go, and there was no good reason not to try it really. It was a really good opportunity to try something new, to try something novel, on the chance that it would work. So in good academic fashion, we managed to publish an article explaining that it didn't work, but that it's still information that's worthy to have. So that was, as an aside, published with F1000 Research, which is an open access online journal. So if you Google Bourke and respond from example of wheelchair users, this will pop up and you can download it for free on the internet. And it explains everything in a lot more detail. So that was really great, but then it left us with the dilemma of we still needed participants for the survey. So then we employed just a classic convenience sample, sorry. So we went back to those modes of contact I talked about earlier. We sent invitations to organisations whose membership included people who use wheelchairs, posters throughout the community, different places, and email requests to personal contacts. Basically any way we could to get people at Christchurch using wheelchairs. We had a total of 49 people respond, plus the 15 from the RDS sample, we had a total of 64. You might notice that the 19 that I just talked about from the RDS sample has dropped to 15. The reason that had, because our aim when we did RDS was to get a national sample, because we wanted to make comparisons between people who lived in Christchurch and were exposed to the earthquakes and people who didn't. Once the game had changed, so to speak, we were more focused on a local sample. 4 of the people in the RDS sample had to be excluded from the analysis. It gets a little less tricky from there on. So just a quick look at the participant demographics. The mean age was around 50 years, and the mean time of using a wheelchair was around 20 years. There were slightly more males than females. New Zealand Europeans were the overwhelming majority, and spinal cord injury was the main impairment that caused people to use a wheelchair. Now, just as a little bit of interest, you might, for the astute observers in the room, notice that I'm a male. I am New Zealand European, although I identify as New Zealand Māori as well, and I have a spinal cord injury. Now, I haven't done any in-depth analysis of this, but it'll be interesting to know whether or not that's a reflection of the personal networks, etc., of myself. But anyway, the first major pattern in the survey data I'd like to talk about is the difficulty people had experiencing community access in different areas of the community. And there'll be a bit of a pattern developing here, as hopefully this graph will show. On the vertical axis there, that's the percentage of participants who identified that these areas, they experience substantial difficulty in accessing these areas. And on the horizontal axis, you've got 3 time periods. Pre-earthquake, the 6 months pre-earthquake, September earthquake. The 6 months post-September earthquake. And the last 6 months at the time that they completed the survey, which generally speaking was last year. So that's footpaths. You can see just over 10% found it substantially difficult to access footpaths throughout Christchurch. Post-earthquake, a huge jump right up to nearly 60%. And you'll notice in the last 6 months it's dropped, but nowhere near down to pre-earthquake levels, suggesting that there's still an issue with community access. And as I go through the rest of those areas, they might not be as pronounced as that, but they're still showing a similar pattern. Lowest pre-earthquake, highest post-earthquake, dropping last 6 months, but still not to pre-earthquake levels. So you can see that's kind of a pattern in that data. a good visual way of doing it after telling you all about respondent-driven sampling, I think. Another big area of the results was social connections. 89% of people said that they had someone to turn to, and a majority of participants also said that they had a positive sense of community, which was great to hear. Family and friends were the most reported people. People could select several different options, that's why it's 80% and 60%. And also health or support workers. What was quite interesting was that there was quite moderate positive correlations between accessing domains that were physical in nature and accessing places for social interactions, suggesting that physical barriers were a barrier to social interactions. The last area I want to talk about is perceptions of the future. This graph here shows that there was almost a 50-50 split in people's perceptions of whether or not there's an opportunity exists in Christchurch to improve accessibility. And what I'd be keen to kind of discuss now is that bit there. That's medium, high, or very high, the opportunity to improve accessibility. And in phase one, there was almost, even though it was qualitative research, it was almost unanimous agreement amongst participants that there was an amazing opportunity. And I think, well, you could hypothesize that there should be more people thinking this is an amazing opportunity. And I'm wondering now, and I'm writing my discussion at the moment, so this is a fluid idea that's developing, but that because it's gone out to about 4 years after an earthquake and community accessibility might not be achieved so well, if people are losing to hope, so to speak, or thinking the opportunity is diminishing, because if it was done in the 2 or 3 years after an earthquake, they would think, yeah, the opportunity is right there and it's been taken advantage of. But like I said, that's a fluid idea that's still developing. Also regarding the future, participants were more likely to report not at all confident, not very confident, compared with confident or very confident regarding local identities and their decisions will be encouraging of an accessible city, which is a little bit disheartening, really. If you look at central government, 70% versus 14%. Local council, 50% versus 17%. Building developers, 56% versus 10%. To provide a little bit of context, in the September 2015 Sarah Wellbeing Survey, 40% of Christchurch residents, that's also disabled and non-disabled, expressed low levels of confidence that recovery-related decisions of local authorities were in the best interests of Greater Christchurch. So the participants in our survey had higher levels, especially with central government, or in all of them actually. So that does reflect, there's been a lot of stuff that comes out that people have been disillusioned with authorities in the rebuild and stuff, so this might be a greater reflection of that also. So the conclusions of this, I suppose one of the main ones is that magnified barriers have been sustained some 4 to 5 years following the initial event. And I suppose this is where my PhD will contribute to the literature, because it's the first study that has used first-hand accounts of disabled people, or people who use wheelchairs, over such a long-term area following a disaster. I think the study that has looked into it the most looked at a period of 2 years after a disaster in the States. So, interesting from a research point of view, not so great if you use a wheelchair in Christchurch. The second one was that disasters provide an unprecedented opportunity for advancing accessibility, and that local disability organisations, having them as leading agents in the recovery process is crucial. In Christchurch we have the Earthquake Disability Leadership Group, so it's fantastic that we've got them, and they're going to be a really crucial cog in the wheel as Christchurch recovers. And when I take the specific findings out to the wider body of literature in this area, the findings challenge this idea that it's participant impairments that are the primary barriers to recovery. And this stems from sort of disability studies and the medical and the social model. Disability, wheelchair users, any barriers that disabled people have faced in the past have always been put down to their impairment, really, as opposed to looking at the wider social factors or the community environmental factors. So most of the barriers in this research, footpaths, housing, are more social and economic issues. So the research here supports that. And it also provides a microcosm into the wider context of community inclusion. It's almost like you look at this wider area of community inclusion for disabled people and hold up a magnifying glass, and the post-earthquake area provides just a kind of magnified look at it, because it brings everything out. I suppose magnified, I can't think of another word apart from magnified, I'm saying it too much. But that's kind of where it fits in the context. And I just wanted to finish with some photos of what universal design can look at, because there has been this kind of cultural assumption that to make things accessible, it has to look bad, or you have to put on a bad ramp on the side of a building, or you have to have accessible toilets or bathrooms with big handrails and they look clunky and things like that. But to steal a quote from Ruth Jones from the Earthquake Disability Leadership Group, she argues that you can have form and function at the same time. It doesn't have to look bad. This is actually in London when I was there in 2011. In Bloomsbury, actually Rick Fry took me on a day trip that day, Rick. And we came across these stairs with a ramp up the side. I just thought, how cool does that look? It's practical. If you, whether or not you walk or use a wheelchair, it works for everybody. It looks really cool. So it's not something that has to be a kind of a clunky, awkward thing. This is another photo of how to get up a steep set of stairs if you use a wheelchair. Still looks exhausting.
As well, Julie.
And this is a photo of what you can do in a lift to make the buttons protrude a little bit so you can hit them if you don't have fine finger function. And also you'll notice there's braille. And actually I think it was Joe who went to a lift in Canada recently, and at the bottom of the lift there were kind of buttons where you could tap with your foot if you used a wheelchair to pick which floor you wanted to go to.
Cool.
Won't want to break your toe on the track.
No.
Break your toe. So I just wanted to leave you with those pictures there, just to leave you with a sense of that accessibility, community inclusion can be achieved just by thinking outside of the square a little bit. But thanks very much for that. If anyone's got any more questions about sampling or anything like that, I'm happy to talk about that in detail, or you can look up that paper online too. So, cool. Cheers everybody.